broadband accessibility, and mapping the digital divide. I'm Tonya Hall, and joining me is Eric Frank, CEO of LightBox. Welcome, Eric.
Well, hi, Tanya. Thank you to having me.
Of course. So, what does LightBox do?
LightBox is a data and information company focused on commercial real estate and land. So we aggregate a lot of data and put it together into analytics to help decision makers in and around the commercial real estate ecosystem. So we help landowners, we help investors, we help folks in appraisal, lending, buying and selling real estate, bring together data to make better decisions about those transactions they're working on.
How has COVID highlighted the issue of broadband accessibility across the United States?
Yeah, one part of our business is we have a geospatial business where we are helping governments and other asset owners identify, where their properties are situated across, the United States. And to do that, we have a mapping, a fabric, if you will, of all the parcels and the addresses across the U.S. And we've been involved in a few initiatives driven mostly by the government, federal government, but it also happens at some state and local levels of people trying to identify what is the real broadband mapping of the U.S. Like what is the true accessibility? Because previously attempts to do this have done this at what they call a census block, which would say if there's a hookup, in this broader area, that means the entire area has access to broadband. Whereas in reality, if you don't have the hookup at your home itself, you don't really have that access to broadband. And back to your original question, right? The digital divide that we have here with more, children, schooling from home, with more folks working from home, with telemedicine, because it's hard to get into certain hospitals during this COVID period. It's become more apparent that access to broadband is an essential need for many people. And, there's a lot of concern that, if this does not get addressed and if we don't rectify access to broadband at the place of where people are living and so forth, that, we're going to, it could be a whole lost year of school for kids, right? Who, have to go to, you hear these stories about, the school bus drives by with a Wi-Fi hotspot, or they have to go to Taco Bell. They can't go to the library anymore, the library's closed, or they don't even have a device. There's still a big gap in terms of getting laptops to people, who don't have these things. So it's a big issue.
What is the role of data and technology in addressing the digital divide?
Yeah, so the Congress passed this Broadband Act, which basically said that from the federal government down to the states that you need to do this mapping because we need to identify where are the gaps in this map. And so there's a lot of technology needed to actually identify what are all the parcels, what are all the buildings, what are all the addresses. That's the first thing that you need to have to figure out who does and does not have broadband. Then you have to overlay that with all of the information from the multitude of providers who are providing broadband to the different states and the counties. And so, it's a pretty big lift to take in all that information, clean up all the addresses associated with the properties and the sub parcels, right, inside of an apartment building and so forth. And then be able to portray an accurate map of, what is the true availability of broadband, how many people have it, how many buildings are hooked up to it. And a lot of people have historically thought that this is a rural issue, right? That, when certain broadband providers haven't laid out the fiber out into the more rural counties, and that is an issue. But you've also seen where states have done the mapping that it's also a big problem in urban areas where there are a lot of neighborhoods and communities that just don't have the technology. The building hasn't been quote unquote wired for it. And so when you previously talked about at a census block, you would say, hey, this area has broadband. Well, that may be true of one building in the area had broadband because it was connected, but many of the other buildings don't. And that's where technology comes into play here to kind of marry what are all the places on Earth and what are all the connections and bringing that together in a way that you can then map it, analyze it, and reach some conclusions.
What are the biggest challenges in building a broadband map, and what are the entities, if you will, that can help address them?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge is, the legislation was passed, but nobody appropriated any, monies to the state governments to actually do the work. And I think probably the challenges is twofold. One, there's technology. There are players like Lightbox, a company called ESRI. There are a few, there aren't that many that can actually assemble all of the addresses and the parcels and say, look, these are all the places in your state or in your community that we've got a map to. But then the state or whoever the sponsor of that map has to go out and reach out to all of the different broadband providers. And then the broadband providers has to produce the information, have to say, these are all the addresses that I have connectivity to. And then you've got to merge that together. So look, I don't think it's a big technological problem. I think it's a will, right? Is there the will to do it? There is some funding needed, but ultimately, there isn't a great proxy for this. So what states are doing, right? Right now you have kids in school and people are trying to advocate for these kids at a very local level and are trying to figure out, how do I know how many of the kids in my school district or the adults who need telemedicine or people who need to work from home, how do I know who's impacted? And without a, kind of this map, they're doing surveys, right? Which you can imagine is not a really comprehensive way of doing this. It's kind of word of mouth and so forth. And so that's why the legislation was passed, because this map is needed to, find out where the digital divide is, and then to bring funding, and there are funding programs to enable this. So it's an economic thing at the end of the day, Tonya, right? You have an issue of the providers of broadband trying to determine whether it's economically feasible or viable for them to bring a hookup to the areas that aren't connected, and then whether the individuals at those areas can afford to pay the broadband expense, right? When you're in this environment and you're not collecting the paycheck, or you're not collecting what you're doing before, and you've got to pay your rent, you got to pay your food bills, $50 a month or whatever it is for broadband is a luxury, right? It's required, right? But it may be something that they can't afford. And so what we're doing at Lightbox is really trying to help, advocacy groups with the data. So, knowing that we have the mapping and the geospatial capabilities, we come about this really just from a advocacy perspective, which is that, if you've got the information on the connectivity, we can map that for people. We're also looking at cell phone telemetry data, right? And using that as a proxy. We're trying to see if we can correlate. The state of Georgia did a map of the entire state. Very few states have done this so far. And we've grabbed a bunch of telemetry data from different service providers to try and see whether we can kind of come up with a proxy that maps to a high degree to the penetration of the actual broadband that the state of Georgia mapped. If we can do that, then we can kind of roll that out and use that as a learning set to try and roll out a national broadband fabric, so that in the absence of what the federal government has asked the states to actually do, we can deliver something that is far better than, survey or incomplete information or census tract information. And that's just part of our, Lightbox advocacy program. It's not a commercial effort.
Eric Frank, CEO of Lightbox. Thanks for shedding some light on this issue. If somebody wants to connect with you, Eric, maybe they want to understand more about the CARES Act and what's being done. How can they help? How can they find that out?
Yeah, our website, it's not great, but lightboxre.com, is where I would start. It has some contact and call to action areas within the website. I think that's a good place. You can find me on LinkedIn, and you can find, my colleagues as well.
Thanks again, Eric.
Thank you, Tonya.
And find more of my interviews right here or at tonyahall.net. Thanks for watching.